For this video, I wanted to break down my process for portrait painting on iPad Pro. I'm using Procreate for the demo, but you can apply this to using other apps. Here is a reference photo of my friend Iris. I keep this on my iPhone to refer to while I'm painting. For the sake of the demo, I'm going to draw on the photo just to show how I visually break up the face into geometric shapes. Now I can move on to the first sketch. I like to start by creating a stick figure to help guide me and get the proportions right. Once that's done, I create a new sketch on top and start drawing lines for where the eyes, nose, and mouth will go. Once the proportions are looking the way I want, I can start breaking down the face into shapes, just like I demonstrated on the photo earlier. Doing this makes it a lot easier to create the underpainting. I always start by blocking in the eyes. I do this because the eyes act as a guide to make sure I capture the likeness of the subject. From there, I follow the guide and paint in the shapes to create dimension. Now you'll notice the paint has a translucent look to it. That's because the brush I'm using is meant to simulate an old oil brush. To make the digital paint look thicker, I take the layer I'm working on and copy it a few times. That step will come later. To create eyes that are more realistic, I generally don't use the color white. In most photos, the eyes are either cool gray or French gray. I can always go back and make them lighter later, but I usually start on the darker side. When rendering eyes, I try to keep liquid in mind when I'm painting, so it looks different from the skin. I've known Iris for years now, so that informs the painting. For me, it's easier to paint people I know versus a complete stranger. For a painting like this, a pre-existing relationship to that person can work like a point of reference. For blocking in colors, I like to not only paint the eyes, but also the various shades of color around them too. This way I can create depth early on and work outward. The eyes are the most important aspect of my painting because it helps with comparisons to the rest of the face. My logic is, I finish them first and I can use them as a guide for the rest of the painting. I can compare the eyes to the forehead, nose, and lips, for example. This was one of my greatest takeaways from art school in general. The next step is rendering the nose, which is a lot easier since the eyes are finished. The video is going to jump to me blocking in the face and rendering the hair. For my painting, I like to start by working on clumps of hair instead of individual strands. I can go back later and embellish. It can also be important to remember what to leave out in a portrait painting instead of just adding for no reason. I can still see through the underpainting to the sketch I created earlier. This helps me build on top of my work. There is no sense in making a sketch and not following it, unless some of the proportions are off. That happens to me from time to time, which is why I take a step back to look for flaws before continuing. I used to just leave it, but if my eyes are trained to notice these mistakes, I should be able to fix them too. Next, I can move on to the hand. I forgot to create the outlines for the color, so I went back to do that on my pencil layer. Hands are complicated, so whatever I can do to make that easier is important. On a tangent, I learned how to draw hands by taking classes with live models. Getting an anatomy book was really helpful too. I remember drawing skeletal hands to get the forms right. It's important to remember the structure and what goes into them. If you can keep that in mind, you're on your way to being able to depict hands. People's hands can be very expressive. For instance, the way she's resting her hand on her face not only makes for a great composition, but it also gives you some insight into her mannerisms. Because of the outlines I set up, I can simply follow them and block in the colors like I did with the face. You'll notice the colors on her hand are a much darker shade than the face. Shadows do interesting things to color. This also establishes that the face is in the forefront. It's similar to having something near to you versus something far away. The fingers were arranged in a way that was a little tricky to paint and draw, so I spent extra time on them. The temptation was there initially to crop them out of the painting, but at the end of the day it wouldn't have the same amount of character. Here I'm going back and forth between painting the highlights and the shadows. It's like a push and pull. The fingernails have another darker shadow underneath them to make them stand out from the rest of the hand. I always put a little shine on them to help with the realism. At this step, I'm working on the right side of the portrait. Most of the shadows are found there, and to match the rules I established for myself, I have to follow that. Basically, my painting is telling the viewer the light source comes from the left, so that means the shadows are on the right. There are plenty of variations to this rule, but for this portrait, it's that simple. The hair on the left side is minimal because of the light source. Her hair is a pale blonde in the painting, so the amount of light makes the majority of it appear white. It also does this cool thing where the eye of the viewer tries to fill in the blanks. I've been trying to leave a little something to the imagination in my work lately. The shadows come first, and then I start painting underneath them to create depth. I'm still painting in clumps instead of strands to achieve this effect. One of the revisions I made to the face involved texture and smoothness. In most cases, I make my subjects a little younger than they actually are. Artists requested a more accurate depiction, though. Keeping that in mind, I made multiple copies of the painting. It is important in general, but extremely important for commissions. The client may want to go in a different direction, and you can't be too careful. I'm using an Apple Pencil to paint because it gives me more control than just using my finger. Also, since I have an iPad Pro, it's just the best setup for this device. Now let's take a look at the finished painting. As you can see, I left visible brush strokes with slight blended edge to achieve the maturity the portrait needed. There was a light source in the eyes, nose, lips, and left cheek. Using the brush for pores, I was able to give iris some subtle texture. That'll do it for my process video. If you enjoyed it, please comment, like, and subscribe. My portfolio can be found at raheemnelson.com.